Okay, Jakob, you can start.
Thank you, Shura. Hello, everybody. Good morning, or good evening, or good afternoon, wherever you are. This is the ARPA Institute panel discussion series. And today we are going to discuss a subject that is very important, but hasn't been discussed, as far as I know, in public so far. The title is Armenian Highlands and Early Hunter-Gatherers to Food-Producing Societies. It is about ancient highlands, ancient people living in the Armenian Highlands. The ARPA Institute, for those of you who are not familiar with it, is an organization, nonprofit organization that was established in 1992 with the sole purpose of helping Armenia to become an advanced society, help in science, engineering, technology, healthcare, many other areas. ARPA is composed of experts from all fields, and we have been working with the government of Armenia, with the Academy of Sciences, various institutes, and the universities, and other public organizations. And we have had many projects, and our current projects involve the most important one is we are establishing a new class 1000 clean room in the Alikhanyan National Lab, so that the scientists in Armenia can carry out very sensitive experiments. We are also working with the Ministry of Education, Science, Culture, and Sports in establishing the process of science fairs in schools of Armenia. This is going to be the third year when the government officially endorsed the program, and they are organizing science fairs in Armenia. And actually, they are also participating in the International Science and Engineering Fair that is held in the United States every year. And many countries participate, and Armenia was not participating earlier. So now they are also participating. And actually, for the first time, they even won an award, which is very encouraging. So we also have, of course, work with the institutes, Institute of Physical Research in Ashtarak, Institute of Molecular Biology, and the Institute of the Alikhanyan National Lab, and Institute of Chemical Physics, and many others as well. Also, of course, the Polytechnic University and the Yerevan State University. We provide both instrumentation, important instrumentation. For example, in the Molecular Biology Institute, we have provided the first sequencer some years ago. Now, of course, that there's more advanced sequencers, but they still use it, and it has been very useful, especially for research programs. And also, we provide guidance. Our experts work with the institutes, with the labs, and provide different advice, and also help in achieving their programs and their research. So the only activity that we have outside of Armenia is organizing such panel discussions and presentations on various topics related to Armenia or Armenians in general. Today, we are fortunate to have a very esteemed panel that is going to examine the early Armenian highland hunters and gatherers. And they're all experts in the field. Boris Gasparian, unfortunately, hasn't joined so far.
He's trying to join. He's trying to join.
Trying to join. Okay, so
yeah.
we're glad that he's trying to join. Okay, he's our main liaison in Armenia, And again, Dr. Phil Glauberman, Dr. Jason Peter Gill, and the moderator will be Professor Ellery Fram. I would like to introduce Professor Fram now. Professor Fram is a PhD in the University of Minnesota. He's a faculty member in the Department of Anthropology and Council on Archaeological Studies at the Yale University. He's also affiliated with the Anthropology Division of the Yale Peabody Museum, and he's the co-editor-in-chief of the Journal of Archaeological Science. Since 2011, he has collaborated on a range of Paleolithic archaeological projects in Armenia, spanning from lower Paleolithic sites such as Renne1 to Upper Paleolithic sites such as Agidou 3 cave, tracing the transportation of obsidian artifacts in the distant past, which allows him to understand how different human groups made use of natural resources distributed across the landscape and how they responded to environmental challenges and how the resulting behaviors shaped opportunities for the spread of technological innovations and social changes. Professor Fram, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me to moderate a panel with three of my good friends and coworkers in Armenian archaeology for the last, for me, 12 years now almost. So we were going to start with Boris Kasparian, who is attempting to join. If you want to take over emailing the individual IDs, he said he was having problems with the link itself, but I did try to send him the meeting ID and password. So what we'll do is we'll wait for Boris to join, although, speaking of, well, while he is joining, while his video is starting, let me introduce him. Boris is a researcher with the Institute of Archaeology and Ethnography at the National Academy of Sciences of Armenia, and he is an assistant professor in the Department of Archaeology and Ethnography at Yerevan State University. Boris has directed and co-directed too many international joint archaeological missions in Armenia to count, but has been doing that since 2000. And as a result of that, he's been an author on about 180, by our reckoning, scientific publications coming out of Armenian archaeology. Amongst Boris's most famous work has been Renne1 cave, where has received attention as holding the world's oldest shoe and early wine producing facility as well. And his excavations are too numerous to list, but amongst the ones you're going to hear a bit about today, both from him and my two other colleagues, will be Hoton X3, as well as Middle Paleolithic sites Hoton X3, Boris 12, and other later sites such as Agidou 3 and Calavan 1. So without further ado, Boris, you have the floor to start telling us what makes Armenia such a special place to do these types of research questions.
Thank you, Ellery-John. Thank you. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for this opportunity to introduce you the topic of this day. You know, when we were deciding with Professor Panosian what to choose to present you regarding the last achievements of Armenian archaeology, I suggested to focus first of all on Paleolithic period, because unfortunately the last year achievements of Armenian archaeology are so wide and time consuming that it's not possible to present all the achievements in one, panel discussion, and I suggested to do it simultaneously, starting from the earliest periods of the habitation of Armenia, the area of Armenia, and Paleolithic period, which seems to many people something, out of their understanding. Maximally people heard about, Homo erectus, I don't know, Neanderthals, and other hominins. And there's not so much attention paid to this important period. But I want to tell, first of all, that, the period is one of the most crucial and important, because our recent studies are showing that all these ideas that were then shaping the standards of civilization, the standards of more developed food-producing societies were established in Paleolithic period. There are so many life-supporting strategies that my colleagues will present you were established at Paleolithic period. And I just want to introduce you in brief,
Boris, if you could move further away from the computer so people can see your face.
Yes.
Thank you.
So I want just to introduce you in brief the study area, why Armenia is so important, by the regards of first steps of establishment of human society, and also very briefly the history of investigations that were carried out during last 20-25 years with the help of our international colleagues, because our cooperation with our international colleagues is the most important, as of it gave us an opportunity to bring in new, study technologies and new scientific methods that were established during the studying of the earliest sites in the territory of the Republic of Armenia. Elerijan, do you have my presentation that you can share, or? Thank you, Elerijan. Can I pass page by page, or you have to do it, Elerijan?
Ellery, you are on mute.
There we go. Too many windows. All right. Yes. I just tell me to do it, Boris, and I will.
Okay, Elerijan. So let's start. Next page, Elerijan. So the area we are talking about, in modern day Republic of Armenia, you can see it, it's more practically the northeastern part of the wider Armenian Highlands, and you can see the area of Armenian Highlands. One of the biggest mistakes that Soviet scholars try to do, they look at the area politically, you hear the term Southern Caucasus, which has political meaning, also Transcaucasus, Caucasia, and so on and so on. In general, Armenia and Armenian Highlands have nothing to do with the Caucasus, and it's part of the wider Armenian Highlands that you can see on the map. And unfortunately, the sites of Armenia were integrated by their study with the sites of the Caucasus, which is completely wrong, and which is, how to say, making the things more complicated and through understanding it in general picture. Next, John. So why Armenia is unique by means of the initial stages of occupation by humans out of their African cradle, you know. The reason is that Armenia has very rich life-supporting and environmental resources. It's a combination of, you know, young volcanism and sedimentary landscapes, which are kind of, you know, distributed together in the area of Armenia. Anyone who was in Armenia can see that after 30-40 minutes of drive, how the zones and landscapes are being changed. So it's suggesting and was suggesting a very diverse, you know, life-supporting resources, starting from deserts to glacial peaks. So it's one of the main important, you know, things in Armenia, besides of saying that it's lying on the crossroads of Asia, Europe, you know, and it was a crossroad of civilizations where people were passing during millennia and were supporting to create human culture in those areas. Next, Elricha. Also, Armenia is very rich with landscape spatial resources, morpho features that were very attractive for early humans. I'm talking about karstic caves. I'm talking about volcanic grottos and small caves. Also, I'm talking about protected alluvial terraces and hills that you can see on these photos, just examples, you know, and Armenia is very rich of this kind of resources, which are very suitable for organizing life in these areas. Next, Elricha. Also, Armenia is one of the richest countries even today by water resources, and it was kind of, you know, heaven in Pleistocene period where hominins were living around, and this is proven by, you know, series of lacustral sediments that are spread all along the country, you know. Assyrians were calling Old Armenian ID, which is being interpreted as country of lakes. So by means of that, Armenia is today is very rich with lakes and water bodies, you know, and you know Lake Sevan, who is the biggest pure water body in all Near East. And here you can see a very beautiful image of lacustral deposits, because if the lake exists, it's living, you know, a special kind of sediments, which we are calling lacustral sediments. And you can see Mountain Aragat and, you know, a section of lacustral sediments. I mean, the lake which lived this sediment, you know, during the Pleistocene period. Next, Elricha. One of the most important things that attracted early humans to this area was the richness of toolstone making raw material sources. You know, Armenia is one of the richest, even being so small, it's one of the richest, you know, areas in the world by means of obsidian. So it has one of the richest obsidian landscapes in the world. And obsidian was one of the most important toolstone preparing, you know, resource that is very well spread in Armenia. Next, Elricha. Meanwhile, Armenia is also rich by other kind of toolstone resources like limestone, chert, flint, I don't know, other types. So you can find any kind of rocks which are existing and which are very suitable for tool preparation. I mean, silicified rocks which after flaking have very sharp edge for cutting and so on and so on. Elricha, next. Also, you know, the study of the lacustral sediments, which I was talking before, especially the imprints which are preserved on these lacustral sediments. There is kind of lacustral sediment which is being called diatomite. So it's being formed in more warm water conditions, and judging from these fossils, we can assume that it has very rich, life-supporting landscapes, biological resources, and so on. So the territory of Armenia, saying in brief, was suggesting very suitable life-supporting resources to early humans, which penetrated here and lived millennia. Next region. So just want very briefly to focus on the history of investigations during the last 25 years, practically during the 21st century. Of course, the study of Paleolithic of Armenia started at the end of the 19th century. It's related to the famous French archaeologist Jacques de Morgan, who collected, first obsidian implements near the obsidian sources. But unfortunately, Morgan and Soviet researchers who followed him, who also investigated the scatters around the obsidian sources, collected a lot of interesting archaeological stuff, but unfortunately not stratified. And just, first attempts were only to adapt the European charts and Armenian material together, showing that the same periods there are existing in capitalistic Europe are existing in socialistic Armenia. In briefly, this was the task of the Soviet, archaeologists. They have done tremendous work, of course, and its re-evaluation today is on the new step, showing how much they did. But of course, as I told you, our international cooperation, which started practically at the beginning of 2000, changed completely the picture of the study of Armenian Paleolithic region. Next, please. So first of all, what we benefit with our international cooperation and what we have with the help of our international friends, colleagues, and partners. First of all, we widened the geographical distribution of Paleolithic sites because, the center of gravity of the study of Paleolithic sites in Armenia was mainly the Hrazdan River Gorge, where several interesting Paleolithic sites were discovered. And, our cooperation immediately, widened the scale, also the quality of these studies. My colleagues will show you. I don't want to focus on these things so much because my colleagues will introduce you more, in detail what we learn from these studies. And of course, we filled the gap which was existing in chronology of Paleolithic period, because, it's millions and thousands of years, and each site is just a spot in the chronological chart. And now, thanks to our investigations, this chart is being filled by new and very interesting sites. Next, Richard. Just the map is showing you just the areas where we work with our international colleagues. So you can see just in brief that this is the Debet River Valley in the north of Armenia, Lori Depression again in the north of Armenia, Shirak in the northeast. So the slopes of Mountain Ararat, Ararat Depression, and Hoton River Basin. So I'm repeating that all our, joint missions just were focused on different parts of Armenia and studied different ecological and morphological zones, which really, all of them gave really very interesting situations and very interesting sites. Elrijan, next, please. So it's just the continuation of, the list of these joint missions is endless. So we have more and more and more cooperation, and it's endless. But this is not the most important case. The case is the quality and new technologies that our international partners bring. We learned a lot from them. So we started, first of all, detailed planographic studies of Paleolithic sites, especially. This is the site Boris 12. My colleague Phil Glauberman will introduce you the results of the study of this huge middle Paleolithic site, which is distributed around on 6 hectares of area. So he will distribute you more detailed how interesting is this site. Next, Ellery. Another very interesting example in the Aparan Depression on the western slopes of Mountain Aragats, where we studied the Paleolithic sites in combination with obsidian raw material sources and the Paleolakes, showing that middle Paleolithic and lower Paleolithic inhabitants of this area were living near the banks of the lakes, were combining the raw material sources and the lake shores, and this was giving them, so more simply, Aparan Depression was looking as a heaven with small lakes and cascades of waterfalls connecting them together. So again, the life was suggesting very attractive conditions for early humans living in these areas. Next, evolution. So I mean, we start looking at the archaeological Paleolithic sites regarding the environmental information, and of course, one of most important issues is that we used, of course, the stratigraphic method combining in cultural stratigraphy, biostratigraphy, and our important information that the sediments which have Paleolithic finds contained inside of them. Next, evolution. Like this is a very good example when you can see, for example, the bioarchaeological and climate information combined together, the climate curve and all the biological information combined with it, which is showing how the life conditions of people living at that time. I mean, it was cold, it was warm, which kind of animals were living around, what they were hunting, what was brought, naturally by the caves, which animals penetrated, which was the objects of game, which kind of plant food they were eating. So it's really a very important information, which besides of being scientifically very important, is allowing to reconstruct the daily life of early humans or their calendar, how they were living in spring, in summer, so and other parts of the year. Next, evolution. Just an example which kind of methods we are using. I mean, many people don't know about this dating methods and so on and so, which is not important. I just want to show you how many methods and their combination, which is the most valuable part, we are using to date and to study the sites. Next, evolution. So, just want to list some important sites that Ellery was talking about. Among our achievements are the Hoton X3 open air site, which is chronologically possibly is contemporaneous to the Manisi, so it's one of the earliest out of Africa sites in the region. Again, open air site of Aravnatun, where we have another very interesting step of development of early humans. Next, region. Norgeli, one of the most important sites that was discovered by our colleagues from University of Connecticut. Jason will introduce you the value and the results, how important is this site by means of technology, by means of preservation, and what it is changing in our view of the general picture regarding the early human spread in the world. This is again very outstanding and famous site. Next television. And finally, one of our most interesting discoveries is the Hoton cave, which is very high elevation. You know, it's above 2,000 meters, and 2,000 meters for the northeastern Armenia is around the roofing of this ecological part or the landscape, you know. So we found here coexistence of cave bears and Neanderthals. It seems there was a very interesting interaction between these animals and humans. So it's very short and small site, but just showing a very brief daily life of Neanderthals living in this region. And possibly it's interpreted that people were trying to pass these mountain ranges and go to the other river valleys. Next television. Another one in Debet River Canyon, again, Debet River Valley, a very interesting site on the border with Georgia, which we are calling Renne1. Again, here, if in the sites that I showed, the most widely used raw material is obsidian. Here you can see these very beautiful Middle Paleolithic points that are mainly prepared on dacite, showing that the inhabitants of Armenia have no problem with processing any kind of raw material. You know, when you look at these artifacts made not from obsidian, because obsidian is a volcanic glass, it's much more easy to nap it and to shape it than dacite, which is a very hard volcanic rock. Meanwhile, when you see these points made in a very high masterpiece, you know, it's becoming obvious that for them there was no problem to shape any of raw material, kind of raw material. Next television. A bison hunting camp, which is located not far from Lake Sevan. We called it Kalavan 2, you know, all these names. Ladies and gentlemen, Bagdatashin 1, Kalavan 2, Hot 1, I want you just to understand, are the names of the administrative centers to whom the sites belong. And it's the legislation of Armenia, and I think it's the same in the world. So where the site was found, you name it, you know, by the name of the village or community to which it belongs. And 1, 2, 6 or 7. If it's 2, it means there is Kalavan 1. If Kalavan 6, it means there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So this is just a very interesting and multi-layered bison hunting camp, which is again filling some gap of how of the lifeways that people were exploiting in the territory of Armenia. And next television. Boris 12. I will not focus on much on it because Phil will represent the results and very interesting results very soon. But just want to introduce you this very nicely obsidian made points. You know, as you can see, these points which are you know, more and more making me to bend my head in front of Neanderthals, you know, because we think they were primitive people and so on and so on. But when you look the technology, when you look the art, when you look the masterpiece, how they created this tiny and very beautiful tools, of course you are starting to respect these people. Even now, if someone will try to do it, it's not that easy. You have to learn to do it. There is a lot of ideas and knowledge behind of this, you know, artifact. So that's why next television, please. And my last example is, you know, Lusakert cave that again was re-excavated by our colleagues from the University of Connecticut with very interesting results, especially Phil will introduce you the control of fire, which is a very interesting topic, but this is one of the nicest examples that how our international cooperation helped to re-evaluate Lusakert cave. It was famous in Soviet times as one of the most important Paleolithic sites in so-called Caucasus. But of course, our study with our international colleagues, how to say, cardinally changed the quality of study and the information which was taken from the layers of this site. So in brief, this is what I was going to tell you. I know I was late, there is not so much time, but now my colleagues will introduce you in more details our works and the results we get from it. Ellery John, thank you very much for your help.
Yes, no problem. Just stop screen sharing here. My window has disappeared. There we go. All right. Thank you very much, Boris. I'm sure there will be lots for us to discuss and lots of questions and threads that we can follow on there. So next, taking the baton from the overview and the resources and landscape and why Armenia was attractive during what we called Paleolithic times to not just modern humans, but to our predecessors. So next is Jason Gill. He's a PhD candidate at the University of Connecticut, and he's been working in Armenia since 2015, working on a variety of Paleolithic archaeological projects there, including sites we've just talked about from the lower Paleolithic, Norgary, Hoton X3, Hotas 1, and Lusakert from the middle Paleolithic. What Jason does is he is looking, archaeologists have been looking at stone tools for a very long time, trying to classify them based on how they look to us in terms of their use. What Jason is doing is he takes theories related to how cultures change and evolve, and then combines it with a lot of newer techniques, 3D scanning, statistical shape analysis, not just it looks like something, but here's how these are different or the same. Because he is interested in how lithic technology, stone tool behaviors changed during some of these transitions that we're going to talk about as we introduce them here in the following talks. And I should also add that right now, as part of his doctoral research, he is co-directing excavations at a site Patavan 4 up in northern Armenia. So Jason is going to focus principally on this earliest period in Armenia that we've been talking about, lower Paleolithic. So think about time here in terms of how it would be layered if you keep pairing things. So the lowest is oldest, and then after Jason finishes, I'll introduce my other colleague, Phil Glauberman, who will then talk about the next slices up, the middle Paleolithic and the upper Paleolithic. So Jason, I hand it off to you.
All right. Thank you, Ellery, for the introduction. I'll go ahead and share my screen. All right. Hopefully you're seeing what I want you guys to see here. So as Ellery said, I'm going to be talking about the lower Paleolithic, the earliest period in the Armenian Highlands, and really kind of the earliest period in which we're talking about kind of material culture behavior in the world. And I do want to kind of echo some of what Boris was saying about the importance of collaboration and all of these teams working together. At the bottom of this slide, I have all of these symbols for different universities because this is really a collaborative effort, and there's no way we could get the quality of research done without everyone that's involved in them. All right, so to kind of ground us in this chronology, building on what Ellery said, kind of layers through time, here's just kind of a very simplified, straightforward chronology of world prehistory up through the early Holocene. We have some of the geological periods here, some simple climate records here, and then these named behavioral periods: Lower Paleolithic, Middle Paleolithic, Upper Paleolithic, some of the technologies that are usually associated, and then even on the far side, we have some of the human ancestral types that are kind of associated with these, right? So I'll be talking about this Lower Paleolithic period, and these periods that we call lower and middle and upper, right? These are based on accumulated changes in behaviors that we've identified in the archaeological record. And there's a lot of variation in when these changes happen in different parts of the world. So the onset in the Armenian Highlands isn't going to be the same as the onset, say, in Africa or in Western Europe. Right, things happen kind of at different paces in different places for different reasons. Right, so highlighted in red now, this is what I'm going to be talking about, and it covers quite a lot of time. Right, this is a pretty long chronological period in terms of what we're talking about. But how I want to start is just to ground everyone in the kind of technologies that we're talking about when we're talking about the Lower Paleolithic. So I'll introduce very briefly the three different types of technologies I'm going to mention. Now, of course, I'm focusing on stone tools here. Our ancestors very likely used things like wood and other materials, but because of preservation, most of our record is composed of stone. So we try and extract as much data out of those stones as we possibly can to try and get at the bigger picture. But starting with the oldest stone tool category in terms of related to our genus Homo, we have Oldowan technology, right? This technology first appears in Africa roughly 2.6 million years ago. It's really simple in how it's produced, right? This is a handheld technology. It's really about making a sharp edge, right? You knock a flake off, which is the top row of this slide. These are flakes from a bigger mass of stone. And these can be used for a number of different activities: cutting, scraping, and related tasks. And then at the bottom, you have these kind of larger masses of stone that now have a sharp edge from those removed flakes, right? These are more heavy-duty tools, probably used for more heavy-duty tasks, such as breaking open bones for marrow extraction, digging and chopping, and other things. Right. Moving on, by about 1 million years, a little less than 1 million years, the next technology that we see appear in the world as a large kind of category would be Acheulean technology, right? Which appears in Africa for the first time at about 1.7 million years ago, right? And people at this time are still using that Oldowan technology. That doesn't just go away. They're using that, but then this is kind of added on, right? And the objective of this technology appears to be to remove these flakes from the mass of stone to create a really refined large cutting tool that we call a Handaxe, right? Now, the flakes are also useful, right? They're certainly also used. Importantly about this technology is, right, it allows us to start making some arguments about maybe language being necessary to kind of communicate how to make these, pre-planned mental templates, right? Maybe teaching as a way of communicating. So this suggests some things are probably happening in the evolution of our ancestors here. And again, this is a handheld technology. And the last technology type that I want to introduce before getting to the Armenian Highlands is that of Lavawa, right? And this is another technology that the earliest appearance we see is in Africa, a little after 500,000 years ago. Right. And this takes kind of some of those principles from the last two technologies I mentioned, and it combines them. It takes that idea of flaking and the idea of shaping, and it puts them together, produce something new. Right. So you still take a mass of stone and you still shape it the same way maybe you would with a hand axe, but now the objective is no longer that mass. It's to remove a flake, right, of a predetermined size and shape, right? That then can probably go into something like a spear tip or into a handle for a knife, right? We do see evidence with this technology for being put into hafts connected to spears and such, right? So suggesting greater control, right? Higher demands on social learning, greater planning depth, right? A lot of these technology changes seem to suggest something about human evolution as well. Right. And I will say this technology is usually associated with the Middle Paleolithic, which is what Phil, co-panelist, is going to be talking about. But it first appears at the end of the Lower Paleolithic and is really important to kind of the story of the Armenian Highlands. With that being said, now let's talk about, right, how people get to the Armenian Highlands in the first place. Right, so if we jump back in time to 2.6 million years ago, we have the earliest members of our genus Homo up here. They're using that simple Oldowan technology, right? Jump forward in time to about 1.8 million years ago, we start seeing Homo erectus, right? This is kind of the first hominin that we have that really has more human-like body proportions, especially in its post-cranial skeleton, right, in its body. It has a larger brain than we had seen previously, but still kind of small by our modern standards. And importantly, this is our first ancestor to leave Africa, right? And the first evidence we have for leaving Africa is from the Armenian Highlands at the site of Dmanisi in the modern-day Georgia. And importantly, right, Homo erectus leaving Africa and arriving in the Armenian Highlands happens prior to the invention of Acheulean technology, right? So as they come up into the Armenian Highlands, they're only carrying this more simple, right, simply produced Oldowan technology, right? And at this site in the Armenian Highlands, right, we have the technology, and we also have a plethora of Homo erectus remains at the site, right? And that really begins our story for the Lower Paleolithic of the Highlands, right? We have Dmanisi as the beginning of this timeline as a starting point. And on this timeline that I put up now, I have a few other sites put here, Norgary, which Boris mentioned, and Azok Cave, which are kind of the end point of the Lower Paleolithic, right? But we have this kind of large gap that I've put here, which is really superficial, because as you can see on this map, there are plenty of sites that we could call Lower Paleolithic sites, but the problem is we don't really know where they fit exactly on this timeline, right? We know that they are Lower Paleolithic in terms of the technology present, right? They either quite like the Oldowan or quite like the Acheulean. Finds from sites like Aravnatun and Mushakan, but we just don't know exactly the technological sequence for much of the Lower Paleolithic. And many of these sites, as Boris maybe mentioned, right, they're surface scatters. Some of them come from Soviet archaeology, right? Some of them are just mixed deposits, so there's mixing of different time periods. Some of what has been called Lower Paleolithic sites end up being kind of natural stones instead of artifacts. But we can start to fill in this gap with kind of recent and ongoing research that Boris alluded to in his talk, right? So I've now put in our timeline a couple more sites. So we have Hotas 1 towards the end of the Lower Paleolithic. We have Renne1 and 2 down by Dmanisi, and we have Hoton X3, which is another site that Boris mentioned. So I'm going to talk about these in very brief terms, and I'll also talk a little bit more about Norgary 1 and how that helps us understand kind of the end of the Lower Paleolithic period. So if we jump to this site of Hoton X3, which is in the Deadbed Valley of northern Armenia, right? This is a well-stratified, multi-layered site that's seen over a decade of work by Boris and other collaborators. Our research team joined Boris on the site in 2018 to start thinking about ways to date the site and better understand what's going on. Now the site has exactly what you would expect if you were looking at Dmanisi. It has the same type, almost identical Oldowan style technology, right? And it's about 60 kilometers or about 37 miles or so from Dmanisi. Right. So it's not surprising that you would find sites with similar technologies and of a similar age close by. The site itself is sitting on top of a 2 million-year-old lava, but we're still working on ways to actually date the artifacts themselves above and beyond that so that we can say it absolutely is in close proximity to the date of Dmanisi. Within the same vein, another site, which I have messed up on the slide header here, but Renne1 and Renne2 are sites that we're kind of in the infancy of our research at. These are in the Vatszor region of Armenia. And again, they're technologically very similar to Dmanisi and Hoton X3, right? That same kind of core and flake old Awan technology. Renne1 is also a site that within the cave contains much older deposits that you may have heard of. The world's oldest leather shoe, early evidence for wine production at much later periods. But as I said, we're kind of really starting the work on the lower Paleolithic elements here. Myself, along with Boris and Phil, my co-panelists, right? We were just there in November doing some initial setup work, which is where this picture on the lower right is from. And this coming June, we're really going to start, pardon the pun, but digging into the lower Paleolithic here to better understand it. Now, if we jump forward to the other end of that gap from that chronology, right, we get to the site of Hotas 1, right, the kind of late Acheulean in the region, and this is a site that was originally dug during the Soviet period. Our team retested this site in 2016 and 17. And this site itself, as you can see in this satellite image, sits on the slopes of Mount Hotas, right, a volcano. The site is represented by the red triangle here, right? The site contains a rich assortment of Acheulean technology, beautiful large hand axes produced on this volcanic glass, right, this obsidian. And thanks to them using this as their raw material of choice, we can actually get a little bit more into what's going on here. Thanks to the work of Ellery Fram, our moderator, we can fingerprint where these tools, where the obsidian was collected. And unsurprisingly, the people at this site were using outcrops of obsidian on the mountain itself. Right? They were specifically using the two closest to where the site is found, here on this image in red and green. And the second thing we can get from the use of obsidian is that we can get a kind of the potentially oldest the site could be, right? The obsidian here, the formation of the obsidian has been dated, right? And it's around 480,000 years ago. So the site can't be older than that, right? And this period of volcanic activity is part of a larger uptick in eruptive activity that produces obsidian in the region starting around 700,000 years ago. Now, also important to this site, Hotas, is that it shows technological change at the end of the Acheulean. So if you remember the Lavawa, the last technology, I talked about it at the beginning. Well, Hotas here doesn't contain any Lavawa, but it contains what looks like experimental pieces that start to look like it, right? So here are some images from 3D scans of pieces from Hotas. Right? On the left, we have these hand axes, these Acheulean hand axes that kind of are turned into Lavawa cores almost. They're not quite there, but they start having a lot of the same qualities. And here on the right, we have what I would call a simple prepared core. Again, starts to look a lot like Lavawa, but it's not quite as refined as we might expect Lavawa to be. right? So this suggests that some of this invention of this technology is happening right here in the Armenian Highlands in the late Acheulean. And this is really important because there's a lot of debate in our field about how this Lavawa technology and the Middle Paleolithic gets to different parts of the world, right? With a traditional view being that it's invented once in Africa, and then populations that are expanding come out with Lavawa. And to that same end, another really important site that lets us explore that question of if Lavawa is invented in the Caucasus, in the Armenian Highlands, is Renne1. Right, this is sitting in the Razdan Gorge, not too far from Hotas. And luckily for us, layers of lava and layers of ash at the site can be dated, and we have a good chronology for it. Right, we know that at oldest it can be 440,000 years old, and the youngest components could be no younger than 310. And we have multiple deposits within that framework. And much like at Hotas, the work of Ellery allows us to understand where the obsidian at the site is coming from. But to a greater degree, now we can think about how people are using the landscape at this site, right? We have Renne1 here on this map in the center, and then we have some of these different volcanoes that produce obsidian, represented by these circles, right? And most of the obsidian is coming from close by at Gatanisar, but people at this site are also going to other places, including Hotas, and including places as far away as 120 kilometers to get toolstone, right? And this means they're moving over different landscapes. They're moving through different regions, from more mountainous regions through more temperate lowland regions. And they're using the whole landscape, and they're collecting materials from the whole landscape. Now, the technology at the site is very telling for us. The earliest parts of the site, closer to that 440,000 date, look very much like what we have at Hotas, right? Mostly Acheulean, with a little bit of experimentation in terms of those Handaxes that are starting to change, and the same with kind of these simple prepared cores that are starting to look like Lavawa. And then in the youngest parts of the site, around 325,000 years ago, we have Lavawa technology. But that technology is found along with more Handaxes and more of these experimental pieces, right? It's looking like, and this is essentially what we argue for the site, that this shows the independent invention of this technology at the site in the region, right? Which means that hominins in different parts of the world were able to pretty much reinvent this same type of technology at different times in different places, based on having this kind of shared technology underpinning it. Right, so that being said, we're left with a lot of questions regarding the nature, timing, and sequence of much of the Lower Paleolithic here in the Armenian Highlands, especially kind of what's happening in really the middle of the Lower Paleolithic. Right, we know people are there early on. We know people are there towards the end of the kind of Lower Paleolithic period, and we have evidence in the form of undated sites that they're there in between, but we just don't know how that chronology all shakes out. We're also left with a lot of questions as to what species of hominin is responsible for a lot of what's going on here. We just don't have a lot of fossil specimens in this region. Generally, a lot of the soils in this region are bad for preservation of bone. Now, of course, at Dmanisi, we have Homo erectus remains, and if Hoton X and the Renne sites can be more firmly associated with that time period, we can make some educated guesses that it's probably Homo erectus. Moving through much of the rest of it, we just don't have good evidence for hominins. We have at the very end at Azot Cave in southeastern Armenian Highlands, we do have the jawbone of a Homo heidelbergensis, which is a predecessor to Neanderthals. And then that's associated with some Acheulean technology. And then in later deposits at that site, there are some Neanderthal teeth associated with later Middle Paleolithic technologies. But we just don't know a lot about what's going on. But that's to say there's plenty of work and questions that our teams can continue to ask and answer through the type of collaborative work that we do. And I guess that's a form of job security for a lot of us, is that there's never going to be a dearth of questions to ask and answer here. And with that being said, there are always more people to thank and acknowledge than there's time and space for. But I always like to just stress again that this is so important that we all collaborate together, both with Boris and other members of the Armenian community, and with all of our colleagues worldwide. And I especially want to thank the local Armenian communities that they're always so welcoming and supportive of our work. We live within these communities when we're there. We work within them. They work with us. We never find ourselves for want of anything while working there. And we certainly could not do what we do without these communities. And I think all of my colleagues from abroad would agree with this. They've really made Armenia feel like a second home to most of us. And with that being said, thank you for your time and attention.
Extremely well said, Jason. Yes, Phil and I would wholeheartedly agree with everything said there about a place that we consider home away from home. I think most of us feel that way, especially having been forced to take a break during the COVID pandemic. I know getting back there this summer felt like just as much as getting back to see family as anywhere else. All right, excellent. And with that, let me introduce Dr. Phil Glauberman, also was at the University of Connecticut back when we first met 12 years ago, something like that. He got his PhD there in 2014. Right now, his primary affiliation is with the Catalan Institute of Human Paleoecology and Social Evolution in Spain. And he maintains a plethora of affiliations, such as the Department of Early Prehistory and Quaternary Ecology at the University of Tübingen in Germany, and with the Institute of Archaeology and Ethnography in Armenia. Phil has been working in Armenia since 2008 and has directed and co-directed numerous excavations of sites that, if I went to list them, you would have already heard them, and he will touch on them again. And what Phil is interested in is, we're back to stone tools. This is what remains at most of our sites. My PhD advisor had a saying that I actually have stitched up on my wall here. Love is fleeting, but stone tools are forever, which will be the takeaway message from today. But what Phil is interested in is not just that these tools are here, but what they can tell us about human behavior. And in fact, that's a common thread for Jason and Boris and I, is what can they tell us about people, and in particular, how the changes in technology and how people chose to use the land differently reflects change in environmental conditions. And I should qualify that when I say people, if you are a member of genus Homo, I consider you people. So Neanderthals are people too, I'm always saying. So what Phil is going to talk about is those next two chunks of time, stratigraphically, the Middle Paleolithic into the Upper Paleolithic, and what has traditionally been affiliated, respectively, with Neanderthals and modern humans. And he's a little less daunting task. He doesn't have to do that 2.5 million years in 20 minutes or so. But take it away, Phil.
Great, thank you, Ellery, for that introduction. And let me just try to share my screen. Just a moment. Seeming to not work. Okay. And is that coming through in full screen?
Perfect.
Okay, great. Again, thanks, Ellery, for the nice introduction. And I'd like to thank Professor Panosyan for inviting me to participate in this panel. It's a really great opportunity to present some of our work to the Armenian diaspora community in the United States, which is something that I don't get to do very often, and it's a real pleasure. So thank you very much for that opportunity. And following along from Jason, I'm going to talk about the Middle and Upper Paleolithic in the Armenian Highlands. And as Ellery mentioned, the Middle Paleolithic is the period we associate with Neanderthals. And the Upper Paleolithic is the period we associate with the expansion of anatomically modern humans or Homo sapiens throughout Eurasia, so moving out of Africa. And I'd like to show the same timeline that Jason showed, and just to give you an indication of where we are now at this point, I'll be talking about the time range roughly between 300,000 years ago to about 14,000 years ago. And as Jason already introduced, and as Boris introduced, this covers the Middle and Upper Paleolithic, where we see Lavawa technology, and again, Neanderthals and Homo sapiens. So I'd also like to discuss a little bit briefly what makes Neanderthals different from modern humans or Homo sapiens. There are some subtle differences in skeleton, and you can see here a Homo sapien skeleton on the right and a Neanderthal skeleton on the left. Note also, just briefly, that I've used the nomenclature here, Homo sapiens neanderthalensis, which indicates a subspecies variant of Homo sapiens. That'll become clear why in a few minutes. But something important to note is that Neanderthals have very large, long skulls, prominent brow ridges, a very large brain, which we should not forget. In contrast to their usual connotation, they were quite intelligent. They have large nasal opening or aperture and no chin. They have an expanding rib cage that we can clearly see here, sort of conical shaped rib cage, which made them rather barrel chested. And they also had very robust bones in general. They had a wide pelvis, as you can see here, more flaring pelvic bones. And they have a short lower leg to upper leg ratio. They had long thighs. And this kind of body type, which would have been rather short and squat, has been theorized to be representing a cold adaptation, an adaptation to cold climates, because Neanderthals were originally found in Central Europe, where it was cold during the Pleistocene period, and people assumed that they were cold adapted, based again on their body type as well. And another theory is that the lower leg to upper leg ratio is an adaptation to rugged terrains. And that's something that may have been very crucial in the rugged topographies of Armenian Highlands. I should also introduce another hominin variant or ancestor of ours, let's say a cousin perhaps, that we only know through the analysis of ancient DNA from bone fragments. And as you can see here, these are tiny pieces of bone that were recovered in southern Siberia at a site called Denisova. And that's all the information we have about what they look like. We know that they're very different from Neanderthals and Homo sapiens genetically, but we don't know how they're different in skeletal form or how appearance. And you can see here that the largest bone that we have that's accepted to be identified as a Denisovan is from China, that mandible you see there. So looking at Neanderthals and where they were in Eurasia, and at least the part of Eurasia that we'll be talking about today, this is their range where we found their fossils and archaeological sites. And the yellow circle is the Armenian Highlands. And Neanderthals were present in this area spanning Western Europe all the way to Siberia since 350,000 years ago to about 40,000 or 30,000 years ago. We see though, at about 100,000 years ago, modern humans or anatomically modern humans or Homo sapiens, or however we should refer to them, us perhaps, we see an incursion or dispersal of them into Southern Europe, the Balkans, the Levant, and the Near East. At the same time, we see Denisovans appearing about 100,000 years ago in Siberia. And we think that, ancient DNA evidence shows that around this time, Neanderthals and modern humans or Homo sapiens interbred, and we believe that happened somewhere in the Levant or the Near East. Also around this time, about 90,000 years ago, we have very clear evidence that Neanderthals and Denisovans interbred and produced viable offspring, represented by a 13-year-old girl, her skeletal material revealed in her DNA that she was the daughter of a Neanderthal and Denisovan couple. And things continue to get more complicated. Around 50 or 60,000 years ago, we see an even bigger widespread dispersal of Homo sapiens into Southern Europe, Mediterranean Europe, and North Africa, when DNA could have as well been exchanged among Neanderthals and Homo sapiens. But by around 40 to 30,000 years ago, Homo sapiens persist, and they're the only hominin species remaining in Eurasia. And as you can see there, the Armenian Highlands is at the center of all of this action. So, zooming in on the Armenian Highlands and the Republic of Armenia in particular, this map is showing you the obsidian sources that we've been talking about. And the blue triangles and squares are showing you Middle Paleolithic cave and open air sites. And something to notice here is that they're not all located near obsidian sources. Some of them are far away from them. And as Boris showed, we find these sites in all of the different, very diverse biomes of the Armenian Highlands, from low elevation river valleys in the north, to high elevation caves at Hoton X3 that Boris mentioned, to alpine mist forests that are relatively high elevation as well, to lower elevation caves in the Razdan Valley, and everything from desert steppe locations like Boris 12 that we heard about, to these upland paleo lake or lakes and meadow contexts. And this really shows us that Neanderthals or Middle Paleolithic hominins were very adept at exploiting all of the biomes in Armenia. And how did they do this? How did they survive and exploit these resources? Through stone tools, which you've heard about, and as Jason explained, the Lavawa technique, which was made for producing relatively standardized cutting tools, and like this point you see here, that were then used for a variety of purposes. In Armenia, we have a ton of obsidian, as we've seen, and probably the most beautiful Paleolithic tools that I think anyone could ever observe in the world. As you see a few examples here from the site of Boris 12 that Boris mentioned, and exactly as we showed with our example, these artifacts start as blanks or flakes that are removed from cores, and then they're shaped further into what we call tools that could be used for scraping, for cutting, anything you can imagine. And on the right, you can also see very similar artifacts made in a variety of raw materials that Boris also mentioned: dacite, flint, chert, and limestone. And something important to note here is that at many of the sites we've excavated and dated, including Boris 12, we see a very standardized, regular, uniform technology, a way of making these stone tools that persists for about 30,000 years. Every site that we excavate that dates to the period between 60 and 100,000 or 60 and 30,000 years tends to have very similar technology, ways of making these stone tools. And it means that this is a very important adaptation to the raw materials in Armenia and also what the tools are being used for. So how did they use these tools? As Boris and Jason alluded to, we have very interesting evidence from throughout Eurasia that Neanderthals or Middle Paleolithic hominins were very adept at using natural adhesives. They could process and manufacture tree resins and utilize natural tar to attach stone tools to organic implements like wood or bone or antler to be able to use them more efficiently. And experimental work has shown that indeed this makes them more efficient. It also gives us indications microscopically where we can identify the remains of this kind of use of these tools, even if the organic materials are not preserved. And in Armenia, we're starting to do this kind of work and trying to investigate our stone tools to see if they were hafted and how they were hafted. Another very important debate that's still ongoing is whether or not Neanderthals were able to make and control fire. And this means, were they able to make it at will? Did they just use natural wildfires to produce all their fires, or could they make it? And research by our colleagues in Armenia, especially at the site of Lusakert-1 cave, the image of which you see here showing you the open hearth or fireplace, Work there has demonstrated very clearly that indeed Neanderthals were making and controlling fire. The fireplace that you see here was made when wildfires naturally would have been very rare in the landscape. And we clearly contributed to this very important debate, which is ongoing. So what were Neanderthals eating? At every single site that preserves bones that we excavate, we find a wide range of animals that Neanderthals were eating. All the way from bovids, bison, you see here, to horses, deer species, and sheep and goats. And all of these animals live in different biomes and environments. Again, highlighting the fact that Neanderthals were excellent at exploiting all of these different landscapes at the same time. Very interesting and important research coming out of all of Eurasia these days is showing us, though, that Neanderthal diets were not completely meat-based as they were previously assumed to be. Dental calculus, the plaque that's attached to your teeth that the dentist scrapes off, is a really good place to preserve starch grains and bacteria, and now DNA as well. That's direct evidence of what people were eating. And this analysis of these materials has shown that Neanderthals ate a lot of starchy tubers like potatoes and yucca, very starchy things like that, mushrooms, nuts, greens. They utilized herbs and seasonings, and they also used medicinal plants. So we have direct evidence that Neanderthals were not only eating meat, and what they were eating, of course, depends on where they're living. So to bring up our moderator, Ellery Fram's work again, something that's become standard practice for us to do, thanks to Ellery's work and all of the amazing obsidian that we get to work with, is that we analyze where they're from, where the Neanderthals are acquiring the material and how they're transporting it around the landscape. And this is a direct, amazing indicator of how they're moving and where they're going and when. And what we see when we look at all the sites you see here that I showed earlier, the data about our obsidian artifact transport, is that they overlap, and they overlap among sources and sites. And what this tells us is that from the image you see here, over a time span of about 30,000 years, the Neanderthals, or Middle Paleolithic humans, again exploited several biomes, but it also gives us an image of where they were moving in space over time, our mobility range. And we see in the Middle Paleolithic that these artifact transports never exceed 200 linear kilometers. And I'll come back to this when I talk about the Upper Paleolithic, but a fantastic view of where these people are moving in the landscape and when. When it comes to the Upper Paleolithic, the earliest site we have in the Armenian Highlands is Akitu 3, as Boris mentioned. It dates to about 39,000 to 24,000 years ago. And here we see a major difference in stone tool technology up here. We see the production of small bladelets that you see at the bottom of your screen. We also see the appearance of bone points and bone tools, more organic tools. This largely, we think, indicates portable tools that were used as projectiles and changed the way people were hunting. They could now hunt animals that are very dangerous from a distance. However, also, work by our colleagues currently at Akitu 3, experimental work is showing that these small bladelets could also be used as inserts to insert into organic materials, like you see this piece of wood there, to be used to harvest seeds and grasses very efficiently. And this is a technology we see in much later time periods with the origins of agriculture. So this may in fact be also what they're used for in the Upper Paleolithic. So what does the Upper Paleolithic diet look like from the perspective of Akitu 3? We recovered a lot of animal bones there, and they sort of seem to tend to specialize more on sheep and goats, with a little bit of horse in there, and they're also exploiting aquatic resources like the trout you see at the bottom of your screen. Very recent research that extracts DNA from sediments, along with the analysis of preserved pollen, indicates that Upper Paleolithic humans were exploiting a wide range of edible plants around the landscape of Akitu 3. A major important discovery at Akitu 3 is the presence of shell beads that you see here, and this partially preserved bone needle that looked something like those that appeared on your screen on the upper right. And this is extremely important because at the dawn of the Upper Paleolithic, when we see modern humans come into Eurasia, we always see them associated with ornaments like this. And the needles were enabling them to produce tailored clothing. And we think that this would indicate something about group identity, social status, things like that. So this is a major transformation in what we see in the archaeological record from the Middle Paleolithic to the Upper Paleolithic. Moving on to the late Upper Paleolithic at the site of Caucasus, which Boris also introduced, we see that the stone tools get even smaller, very tiny projectile points. We also see evidence for structured hearts or stone-lined hearts. And very importantly, at this site, we see the structure of daily activities or dwelling spaces. And what you see on the bottom right, there are thousands of animal bones here, and the vast majority of them are one species of wild sheep. So what we see at this site and what we see developing here towards the end of the Upper Paleolithic is intensive hunting of a single species, perhaps seasonally, and very importantly, structured settlements, like you see at the Reconstruction on your right. So moving back to our obsidian sourcing, what you see on the screen now is the Middle Paleolithic sites I showed you earlier and the artifact transports indicated by the white lines. During the Upper Paleolithic at Armenia, which you see in red, around 39,000 years ago, we see that the transport distances, the maximum transport distance, is about the same as it was during the Middle Paleolithic. Bear in mind that 39,000 years ago, we still have Middle Paleolithic sites that overlap in time with this site. And the transports that you see here happening to Armenia overlap in space and time with Middle Paleolithic sites. And this suggests that the occupants of Armenia were utilizing the same obsidian sources at the same time as the Middle Paleolithic hominins in the other parts of the Armenian Highlands. At around 29 or 30,000 years ago, the picture changes drastically. We start to see transport distances of greater than 200 linear kilometers. Neanderthal sites all disappear. So we can come to a few conclusions and make some observations that we've observed and ask a bunch of important questions that we probably can't answer and we will try to answer. So we've seen that both Neanderthals and modern humans or Homo sapiens were highly mobile, very skilled hunter-gatherers. They practiced very sophisticated technologies. Both were very well adapted to the ecology and terrains of the Armenian Highlands. But we do observe important differences in their technology and their behaviors. During the Upper Paleolithic, we see very small stone tools, sophisticated composite tools, and bone points, these suggesting portable or specialized tools that could be used as projectiles and support hunting from a distance. We also see the development of structured space, structured living space, or settlements. And we, of course, see that Upper Paleolithic tool stone transports are longer than during the Middle Paleolithic. So the biggest question that we continue to ask and debate is what happened to the Neanderthals during the Middle to Upper Paleolithic transition? Were Homo sapiens, did they practice a more efficient hunting and gathering behaviors than Neanderthals? We can ask, were Homo sapiens more highly mobile? Did they have larger foraging territories, larger populations, and or larger social networks than Neanderthals? Some other very big questions that perhaps we can answer with future work in the Armenian Highlands are, were Neanderthals and Armenian and modern humans or Homo sapiens in the Armenian Highlands at the same time? Did they meet and interbreed there? We've also sort of seen, and we can still continue to ask and test, whether they exploited and competed for the same resources. And in the end, did Homo sapiens outcompete Neanderthals? And I will conclude with those questions for the sake of discussion. And I would like to thank, in the same vein that Jason so elegantly put, all of our Armenian colleagues and collaborators, local people, everyone that supports our work in Armenia. None of it can happen without them. And also the funding bodies that have supported the projects that I've presented to you. Thank you very much.
You can also see there, that was fantastic, Bill, that we are thankful for Horvats as well. That made you, it's got its own photo entry here into the thank you slide.
It's a crucial part of our work.
It's a crucial part of our work. Thank you so much, Phil. And so we could go a few different directions with this. I'm happy to take the lead on steering the directions here. You can see we are all passionate about our research, and getting us to be concise is challenging. And we will just talk till there's one person here probably. I'm happy to open the floor to questions. Either you can raise your hand, ask it verbally, or I will keep an eye on the chat as well, and I can pick questions from that. But I can start with a few aspects of this. I think from a broader question, we've talked about kind of the last 10 years or so of research. I mean, any of you, and perhaps Boris is most qualified to answer this, as he has an encyclopedic knowledge of the work that was done both prior to the last 10 years. But from any of you, I mean, what has surprised you most about the archaeological finds in the past 10 years in the Highlands, or what's been most exciting of the aspect of the research that you're kind of most passionate about to pursue, that maybe 10 years ago, prior to a lot of these collaborations, we might not have been able to address? If anyone wants to run with that, I'll be happy to. Don't make me call on you guys. Boris, you want to start us off? What's been the most surprising from the last, say, 10 years of research in Armenia?
Well, John, many things surprised. Of course, it's a long list. I mean, and if I will focus on it,
you can give
maybe...
your top three.
Yes.
You can give your top three.
You know, no, I will focus on some very important things. You know, first of all, what was really making me happy, that, you know, it's not bad than me, that Soviet scholars declared that Armenia and Armenian Highlands were not populated in Upper Paleolithic. The reason that they think the area was very high, and it's the period of the very cold climate, so they declared that hardly the area was populated, and people moved, you know, to more lowlands, to Rioni River basin near the Black Sea, to Syria, and so on and so on. So I think one of our biggest achievements is that we discovered anatomically modern humans, you know, in Armenia, and you know, the body of the so-called Upper Paleolithic sites is growing. You know. Also, another, you know, philosophical maybe aspect of this, which is regarding Hoton X3 and Norgeri, that tractor is the most dangerous, is the enemy of archaeological sites. But meanwhile, when your sites are buried under thick lava flows, or under 6-7 meters of sedimentation, then there's no way. If there's no tractor, no section cutting, no excavations by, you know, constructors or mining and so on, you will never see those sites. You know, it's amazing. It's dualism. From one hand, tractor is the enemy of the site. From another hand, no tractor, no site. You know, this is really amazing. And of course, one of the most amazing things was already, not by means of the finds that we have here, and by regarding lower Paleolithic and Chalcolithic and so on, and this fantastic preservation of the organic material, you know, which I would never expect, but in these two, you know, sites, Hovk and Areni, where the cave bear bones in Hovk, as one of our colleagues, he is an famous archaeologist, said, the cave bear bones are coming from sediments like they are originated yesterday from butcher's shop. You know? So the preservation, the environment of the caves, you know, like the shoe and so on and so on. I will tell you in brief about Areni that when we start excavating, our British colleague with our Armenian colleague start the excavation of the caves, they called me and say, you know, we are finding, because the aim of the excavations was the Paleolithic period. Nobody expected, you know, Chalcolithic sequence in Renne1 cave, and they called me and say, you know, Boris, we are finding clothing, wood, textile, you know, basketry and so on. And I say, oh guys, this is maybe ethnographic period, you know, just let's not destroy it, just let's respect it, but let's go deeper quickly. And next day when I was there, I was amazed looking at the shape of the vessels and understanding that it's impossible that this might be an ethnographic period material, you know. These environments really, all of them, are preserving, saying more intriguingly, you know, so many secrets, so many interesting aspects that one human life is not enough. As Phil said very correctly, and Jason, you know, there are more questions rising than the answers are coming. Each time we are digging, we are thinking that, oh, we solved the problem, we know now for sure, but then the site is, how to say, raising more questions than giving the answers, you know, which is nice, you know, this is life. This is life of archaeologists, to pick up answers, but to get on the shoulders more questions, you know, and this is one of the amazing sides of archaeology itself. So this religion. If the guys have to add something, sorry that I'm saying, guys, as they mentioned, Armenia is really the second home for them. And it's not just a scientific cooperation, believe me, these people are our family members, you know, they are not less Armenians. I'm not saying it by means of nationalism, but friends and family members, really. Years and years working together, we adapt to each other. And I think it's one of the most beautiful parts of archaeology, because beside of science, friendship, nice human relations, you know, is the thing that is. So I mean, once we will go old, we will pass this world, our memories will live with these nice, you know, relations, and our articles will live, you know, that we published. And I think it's really very important, because when you look behind the mass of articles that is published on our studies, and I know how much will be published, is one of the most amazing thing, because it's a constant value. It will live forever, you know, even when we will not exist. So that's it, John.
Very good. Do you want to get chime in, guys, or I can? It's hard to top. It's hard to top that. I feel you've been working there. You've since 2008. You can. Is there something that 15 years ago, when you first went to Armenia, you know, if you told yourself now what we would have figured stuff out, what would be most maybe surprising to 2008 Phil arriving in Armenia for the first time?
I think for me, every time I go to Armenia, starting that long ago, I'm always impressed by how much archaeological material is visible, is accessible, is known, and how much every time we go to a new place and start to work, we come up with really game-changing results and things that have not been studied before, methods that have not been developed before. This has been happening since the first day we arrived, and it continues. It's an amazingly rich place archaeologically, and academically, it's yielding some fantastic results that are changing the way we think about human evolution.
Yeah, I mean, I can say from a personal perspective, having done obsidian sourcing mainly to the southwest in Syria and into Mesopotamia and so forth, where obsidian is a rarity. And I remember showing up in Armenia that first week, and I'm like, it's everywhere. Oh my God, how do you even wrap your head around this? And what do you could throw out the book. And I'm okay, by week 2, there was less panicked. and more thinking, wow, there's huge potential here to just do some amazing sort of research. And so, yeah, I'll second that, Phil. Jason, I'm gonna give you the question that I get asked all the time if I'm at a party and people are like, "Oh, you're an archaeologist, and what's your specialty?" And I'm like, "Oh, yeah, I look at 400,000-year-old sites in Armenia." How do you know how? We've given dates throughout this. So for the non-specialists here, how do we, all those dates you gave, how do we know those dates? Or how do we guess at them?
First I just want to say, I want to echo like your amazement about the obsidian the first time you arrived, because I've worked in other obsidian bearing regions, and you're right, it's kind of like, it's a rarity, it's special, and you get really excited when you find a piece and you're like, amazing. And then I remember like just driving back from the airport my first year in Armenia and being like, oh my God, you can just see obsidian everywhere. And watching new archaeologists as they come each year now kind of come to that same like, oh my God, there's obsidian everywhere. It's like a really cool experience. But to get to your question about dating, because I have thrown some dates out there. I mean, a lot of our dates are coming from the fact that this is a very volcanically active region, which I mean is another thing that makes this region very special, is that we can date all of these volcanics with potassium argon or argon dating, in which we can kind of look at the transfer between those two elements to understand how long it's been since a volcanic eruption produced them. So when I'm talking about that date for Hotas, right, when the obsidian is formed, right, it was dated by other people, not us, using these methods, and it gives us a data as to when that formed. With sites like Norgary, we're extraordinarily lucky with that site, because a lava flow essentially came down on the landscape, and then sediments came and built above it. Later volcanic eruptions deposited ash in those sediments, and we can use those same types of dating to date those ashes. And then at the end of this sequence, another lava flow came and it covered the site. So one, that protects it from disturbance, but it also, we can date that lava flow at the beginning, at the very bottom, right? You're going back through time as you dig down. So the very bottom, you get that date for Norgary 1, 440. You move up, the ashes that get incorporated into the sediments, right? Those are produced when the volcanoes are going off. We can get that date. And then the top lava layer, we know that there's absolutely no way, right, the sediments formed after that. But that's again, because this region's so volcanically active, we can ask and answer these kind of chronological questions about it. We do have other dating methods as well, of course, that Boris kind of touched upon, things like OSL, optically stimulated luminescence dating, which is something we've done at a number of sites, including the site I'm working on now, Pictivon up in the north, in which we can tell the last time the sediment was exposed to sunlight, because certain kinds of crystals in soils trap charges, and we can release those charges and count them. That's something that we've been using at a number of sites to get some dates as well. So there's a number of absolute dating methods like that. And then we have, kind of these relative dating methods where we say, well, this technology is older that we know of than other technologies, and we can kind of fit it into a sequence. But again, we need to build up a much better chronology of especially the lower Paleolithic to be able to do more of that relative dating with future sites.
Excellent. Phil, I'm going to throw this one to you. It's from Armin. How important is finding human and that hominin, Neanderthal, yada, yada, remains for better understanding the archaeological material? What do we get? What can we say if there are those human remains with them, or hominin remains with them, that we couldn't be able to say otherwise?
Yes, thank you for your question, Armin. It is a very good one, one that can drive a discussion that would be never ending, but really a great question. there's a lot of these sites that we mentioned that we assume that they are Middle Paleolithic, and therefore the artifacts are made by Neanderthals. But the fact is, we have not found many hominin remains. We have not found a lot of any Neanderthal bones associated with any of the recently excavated Middle Paleolithic artifacts. There is evidence of Neanderthal bones being recovered at Lusakart 1 cave, at Yerevan 1 cave, but these were recovered in older excavations. The information about the context of those finds is not very good or missing. The finds themselves are missing. So to answer your question, it's extremely important because we don't know who's making what. We also have not found yet clearly modern human remains associated with the Upper Paleolithic. So without those remains, though, there are new techniques that have been developed, such as deriving DNA from sediments or from other parts of things we excavate, even artifacts themselves. So we're trying to get to know who's making what in indirect ways if we don't have any fossils. And a lot of that work is taking place among our colleagues in the Armenian Highlands, and the results we're awaiting with bated breath. And if we can find a way to tell who's making what, the results could be very exciting. Let's put it that way.
Excellent. Thanks for that answer. Okay, while we're seeing if people still have other lingering questions, how about from each of you a takeaway message or what you want our audience today to mostly remember from whether it's something you were talking about specifically or whether it's from the broader topic of these early humans in the Armenian Highlands. So I won't call on any of you yet. I'll give you a chance to volunteer. But you know, what's as everyone leaves today, is there something you want them to think about or remember from what you said?
I mean, I think the biggest takeaway is just how extraordinarily rich the area is in terms of these Paleolithic periods, and that there's so many important questions about human evolution and how the world that we live in came to be much later that can be answered in this region, and that really the research in terms of how much has been done, there's so much more to do, and that Armenia is a fantastic place to ask and answer these kinds of questions, because of just how, as Phil said, how there's just artifacts and archaeological sites everywhere, and there's so many questions to be asked about them, and it will take lifetimes and lifetimes worth of work before we answer even a small amount of the questions we already have, let alone the questions that will come from it. But I think it's just the rich diversity that this region at this kind of center as a crossroads between different parts of the world contains.
Phil or Boris, do you want to chime in with a takeaway?
I can sign what said Jason under it, 100%. But meanwhile, want to add another important aspect. These projects, this kind of investigations are science from one hand, but from another hand, this is one of the best ways to protect the heritage. I mean, I want to repeat again why I consider Paleolithic period very important. If we put aside they are our ancestors, blah, blah, and so on, this is clear. This is speculation, from one hand. But from another hand, these sites have world value. They change our attitude to some questions, Archaeology, you can compare archaeology with a big pot where every archaeologist is putting, a drop of water, and then it's becoming a big pot, of our knowledge, and the sites of Armenia are changing some insights, some theoretical views, it's really an important area by means of archaeological study, landscape, and so on of the past. Meanwhile, as I want to repeat that it was Paleolithic period where all the values of civilization were shaped. You know, it's in the base. All these ideas, all these criteria of tool preparation, technological arming, and so on were established. All this knowledge for further societies, and you see our title is from hunter-gatherers to how to food-producing societies, because if there will be a chance to do a next panel, we will introduce you the connection between the hunter-gatherers and food-producing societies where the civilization standards were established. And Armenia has a big input in these standards, you know. And last thing, it's science, but from another hand, this is the best way to protect these sites, you know, because Armenia is the part of an old world. Each corner of the country is full with very interesting archaeological sites. And thanks to God, our projects saved a lot of them, like Renne1, you know, like Hoton X3, like Prehistory. Each time when Jason or Phil or someone is working, he's in someone's garden, you know, in someone's mining area, and so on and so on. The government is not, the system is not ready to protect this much. You know, each time the same argumentation going, oh, you are excavating too much. Yes, we are excavating too much. But from another hand, if we will not excavate, the tractor will excavate. So this is really very important. And thanks to God, I'm saying again, our funding bodies, like we have the Gafola Renaissance Foundation, our Renne Cave Consortium, you know, the government gave us Renne1 Cave to use under tourism. All the funds we are collecting in Renne1 Cave are being reoriented to new archaeological excavations, new protection operations, and so on and so on. So it's an endless, you know, process. But all our colleagues working here, they have a big input, not only intellectually in Armenia, but also they have their biggest input through their grant and funding bodies to the protection of these sites, you know. And usually Armenia is a small country. There is very little land, you know. Mayors of villages, local villagers, they don't like when you say, you know, here is an important archaeological site. It means the tractoring of the land, any other activities are stopped. They don't like it. And it's very difficult to convince the Ministry of Culture that this is an important site because people are not happy with archaeology. By that means they don't understand it. They are saying that we are, each stone you are declaring as an important archaeological site and so on and so. So we are trying, first of all, to change the thinking, to explain them that it's better, you know, to protect the site, excavate it, organize tourism and so on, which will, the community will benefit. And Renne is the, how to say, best example, because years ago, who knows Renne? Now, based on all this shoe, based on the winemaking unit, based on what we will do with Phil, Jason, and Ellery in the future to find this early human site there, which will be again a very important thing by means of world archaeology, is making the village famous. Tourists are coming a lot. They are buying their fruits. So, you know, I don't want to focus on it. So we are considering that our projects, from one hand, are an excellent scientific effort, but from another hand, this is one of the most important protection and how to say, publicizing events for these sites. So that's
Excellent.
it. John, thank you.
Excellent. Let me jump onto, we're getting a few questions. One I can briefly comment on. So Sylvie said that, you know, driving through the Armenian dry landscape, her quotation marks, one would never imagine of the wealth that the landscape produces. You know, and that was really interesting. But at the, you know, so there's two factors at play here that, you know, make it really exciting for us to work in Armenia. And one side of it is that yeah, if we're driving from Zvartnots Airport through Yerevan up to Lake Sevan, especially in summertime when we're there, it does seem some really dry. But then once we get to the north, you can have wooded mountain areas. We can end up in extremely humid parts of Hoton X3. And then if we can get up to high elevations like the Geram range to some of the obsidian sources up there, which I did this summer, and there's snow while everyone else is melting down in the Ararat Depression. So on one side, we get huge variations in climate simultaneously in Armenia, as we're showing in some of those maps, but also the climate change through time, right? So I think a popular misconception that I encounter a lot is that there was the Ice Age. When we talk about the Ice Age, we usually mean just the latest Ice Age that happened around the world, and that there has been multiple swinging back and forth in the climate between hot and cold. And so we even number these even odds as we call them isotope stages based on climate reconstructions. And so we're in a warm period now, which is 1, and the Ice Age was 2, and the warm period before that was 3. Well, sites that we're talking about now, like Norgeri, that's isotope stage 9 and 11. So this is how many fluctuations globally between hot and cold, wet and dry that we are getting all in one landscape. So between all the little different environmental zones that exist simultaneously, but also then how they change through time on top of that, again, is one of those reasons that the Armenian Highlands is an amazing place to work. We have a question from Professor Panosian. Phil, I'm going to throw this at you since this is kind of related, but anyone else can chime in too. What about, in terms of archaeological discoveries within the modern internationally recognized border of the Republic of Armenia versus the broader Armenian Highlands in terms of into Turkey or Georgia or Azerbaijan or Iran? What obviously international borders didn't exist. So what for many of you are some similarities or differences that we see across the larger Armenian Highlands?
Can I answer?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, but Boris, you go for it.
Professor, it's
Phil's
a very
relieved.
good question. Thank you again for this question. Why my colleagues know how much I'm, how to say, panic to this term Armenian Highlands. I'm one of the, how to say, protectors of this term, because the reason is that Armenian Highlands is not only a geographical morphological unit, which was separated, justified by means of orography and other geological and geomorphological science. It's a cradle of many cultures. You go a little bit north from Armenia, east, west from Armenia, there are cultures that were established in the boundaries of this geographic unit. So it's not only a geographic unit, but it's a cultural unit, a cradle where many interesting cultural phenomena were, established, and even there are periods which are showing that these cultures were influenced the neighboring areas. So dividing Armenia from the Armenian Highlands. So a nice example is the early Bronze Age culture of Armenia, which we call Kura-Araxes culture, because first sites that were found were in the middle part of Kura and Araxes rivers. Now, it's very challenging when people are calling the one in Turkey, they are calling it, Anatolian early Bronze Age culture, Transcaucasian Bronze Age culture, and so on, dividing this phenomenon into different parts. It's one cultural entity, it's one cultural process. So by that means it's the same, absolutely the same. What you have in Lake Van, for example, the Chalcolithic culture of Armenia, it's obvious that it's related very much to the Lake Van area, the Urartian culture, or so-called One Kingdom culture, So it's one big unit. Of course, there is a core and peripheries. I mean, you will see that the peripheries look a little bit, which is natural, but it's not, I'm repeating, only a geographic unit, but a historical, cultural unit as well. That is why, I don't like the term Eastern Anatolia. I am okay with Eastern Turkey. I don't like the term Eastern Anatolia. There isn't Eastern Anatolia at all, So this is the case. This is the case. But culturally, even the Paleolithic period, with Phil, we saw recent studies of the obsidian sources near one. The Acheulean material is one-to-one what we found here in these parts of the Armenian Highlands. And please bear in mind that thousands of years ago, they were not Armenians, Turks, I don't know, nations at all. People live just, they exploit the resources, the culture and, the nature and the resources were dictating or shaping these cultures, So similar geographic, climate, and other conditions, of course, were pushing to shape similar cultural phenomena. So it's similar. It's one world. It's one world.
Yeah, that's fantastic, Boris. And from my perspective, as looking at the obsidian, geologically, the volcanic section of the Earth that we're looking at crosses from Eastern Turkey all the way through any of the countries that we normally lump into the Southern Caucasus, and we find artifacts from, even as Phil showed at Agitu, some of those long distance transports are from what's now Turkey. When we're in northern Armenia, we'll find obsidian from Georgia there, and perhaps vice versa sometimes. I've identified Armenian obsidian at Neolithic sites in the middle of Turkey, distances that you wouldn't possibly even have thought of. But now we can identify them because we're able to have these relationships that, prior to 1991, the sources of obsidian from what was then the Soviet Union was hard to get a hold of as a Western researcher. One of the places that we do not see back and forth of obsidian, and then there also seems to be kind of genetic differences as well, and some lithic technology differences, is the Greater Caucasus mountain range between Georgia and Russia. There's one obsidian source on the northern face of the Greater Caucasus, and you don't find it in Armenia and Georgia, and you don't find it the other way around. That was a pretty big biogeographic barrier in the past. Not that there wasn't movement, but you went another way if you had your choice. Very good. Well, we're after 3 o'clock. Anything final thoughts that our panelists would like to add? Anything that we didn't touch on that you're burning to share or make as your kind of the final thought to leave everyone with? Even we're getting tired out, I can tell. All right. I think. Oh, one thing I even have my own question, and I will answer it myself. If people are interested in this, and pardon the pun, what should they dig deeper into to learn more? I'll put a plug in for this lovely book, co-edited by Boris, Stone Age of Armenia. But you can also find our materials around the web, or ask us for things if you want to see papers that we have written. We also try to write, our book chapters are usually more accessible, I would think, to they're less jargony sometimes. But feel free to, you've got our names and you've got Google, so you can find things that we have written. This has been a great pleasure. I think it's clear that all of us are quite passionate and interested and invested in not only this research, but our time and our friends and our family in Armenia. I absolutely adore my work there, and it is fantastic to keep doing this. I consider myself very lucky to have wound up in Boris's orbit. We should schedule this again for 10 years, another ARPA session. We'll see what we got wrong, or what we got right. But thank you so much, especially to Dr. Panosian and other ARPA members for facilitating this presentation. And we're most welcome and happy to accept your invitation to do this. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Ellery, and thank you, Boris and Phil and Jason. This was a very exciting panel discussion, and I myself learned a lot, and I'm sure everybody did, because this is something we're not familiar with. So actually, I would really like to have a follow-on on this, to talk about the relationship, as Boris mentioned. And so we will try to organize another panel discussion of this sort. And thank you, everybody, for joining us today. Our next presentation this time will be a book presentation. It's called Sadani Juda. It's in Armenian, by Horen Aramuni. This essentially presents all the activities and all the life-changing phenomena that happened to the Iranian Armenians. So it's essentially the lifetime of Armenians in Iran. So you'll all be receiving the announcements, and you'll be, I'll thank you to join us again. It will be on February the 4th at 10 a.m. again. So we hope to see you then. In the meantime, if you like what we are doing, please donate to the ARPA Institute as much as you can, because there's a lot of things that we can do in Armenia. Thank you very much, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you,
very
guys.
much.
Thank you, guys.